In the summer of 1942, the German army still appeared unstoppable. 1 year earlier, during Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Entire Soviet armies were encircled. Millions of prisoners were taken. Vast regions fell under German control. But by February 1943, an entire German field army, the Sixth Army, would be destroyed. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers would be killed, wounded, or captured. The turning point was a city on the Volga River. Battle of Stalingrad. This was not just another battle. It was a moment when the strategic initiative in the East shifted permanently. But here is the key question. Was Stalingrad lost in the streets of the city? Or was it already unwinnable months before the encirclement? Tonight we examine the strategic goals behind the 1942 campaign, the logistical collapse behind German lines, the brutal reality of urban warfare, the command decisions that sealed the Sixth Army's fate, and why, by late 1942, Stalingrad was no longer winnable. The strategic gamble of 1942. After failing to capture Moscow in the winter of 1941, German strategy changed. Instead of another direct drive toward the Soviet capital, Adolf Hitler shifted focus south. The new plan was called Case Blue. Its objectives were ambitious. Seize the oil fields of the Caucasus, cut Soviet access to the Volga River, cripple Soviet fuel supplies, force economic collapse. Oil was the central issue. Germany lacked sufficient domestic petroleum. Romanian oil fields were not enough for a prolonged war. Meanwhile, Soviet oil production in the Caucasus represented the backbone of Red Army mobility. The Volga River was equally critical. It was a primary transport artery, carrying oil, grain, and industrial materials north and south. If cut, Soviet logistics would suffer severe disruption. Stalingrad, located on the western bank of the Volga, became strategically important not because of its name, though its name carried political symbolism, but because of its position. However, even before the first street fighting began, the campaign suffered from a structural flaw. The German southern offensive was split into two army groups. Army Group A, advancing into the Caucasus. Army Group B, advancing towards Stalingrad. This divided focus stretched logistics across hundreds of miles of open steppe. Fuel had to travel immense distances by rail, and rail lines had to be converted from Soviet gauge to German gauge before use. Every mile forward meant longer supply routes, fewer reserves, thinner flanks. By August 1942, German forces reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, but they were already operating at the limits of their logistical endurance. The collapse of German logistics. Logistics determines the limits of operational reach. And by the time German forces reached Stalingrad, those limits had nearly been reached. The Sixth Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, was expected to capture the city while other forces pushed south. But several problems emerged. 1. Overextended supply lines. Railways were insufficient. Trucks were overused and breaking down. Germany lacked enough motor transport. Horse-drawn wagons were still heavily relied upon, an often overlooked reality of the Wehrmacht. Fuel shortages became chronic. Ironically, an army advancing to capture oil was running short of fuel. 2. Luftwaffe limitations. The German Air Force had been heavily engaged since 1941. Aircraft losses, maintenance shortages, and pilot fatigue reduced operational effectiveness. Air support, which had been decisive in earlier blitzkrieg campaigns, was now inconsistent. 3. Weak flanks. Perhaps most critical. The flanks of the German Sixth Army were not secured by elite German divisions. Instead, they were held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces, brave soldiers but under-equipped, undersupplied, and lacking sufficient anti-tank weapons. The Red Army recognized this weakness. Soviet High Command, Stavka, began planning a counteroffensive not against the city itself, but against these exposed flanks. Meanwhile, inside Stalingrad, the fighting turned into something entirely different from the rapid maneuver warfare of 1941. The reality of urban warfare. When German forces entered Stalingrad in September 1942, they expected a difficult fight. What they encountered was something closer to attritional annihilation. The Soviet defense was commanded by Vasily Chukov of the 62nd Army. Chukov adopted a brutal but effective tactic: hold the enemy close. By fighting at extremely short range, sometimes within the same building, Soviet troops neutralized German artillery and air power. This became known as Rattenkrieg, Rat War. Factories turned into fortresses. The Red October Factory, the Barricadi Factory, the Tractor Factory. Each changed hands multiple times. Combat occurred, floor by floor, room by room, sometimes hand to hand. Snipers became symbols of resistance, though often mythologized later. But the essential reality was this: the German army was not designed for prolonged urban siege warfare. Every building captured required manpower to hold. Every advance cost irreplaceable experienced troops. And while German forces bled inside the city, Soviet forces continued building reserves outside it. By October 1942, the Sixth Army was deeply committed. Withdrawal would have meant abandoning months of effort, politically unacceptable to Berlin. And that political dimension would soon prove decisive. Operation Uranus, the encirclement. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. This was not an attack on the city center. It was a massive double envelopment aimed at the Romanian-held flanks north and south of Stalingrad. Within days, Romanian Third Army collapsed. Romanian Fourth Army collapsed. Soviet armor formations advanced rapidly. German relief units were insufficient. On November 23rd, Soviet forces linked up at Kalach. The Sixth Army was encircled. Approximately 250,000 Axis troops were trapped. At this moment, the situation was not yet hopeless. A breakout attempt might have succeeded if executed immediately, but instead, a critical decision was made. Adolf Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to hold its position. He was assured by Hermann Göring that the Luftwaffe could supply the army by air. This promise was unrealistic. The Sixth Army required roughly 600 to 700 tons of supplies per day. The Luftwaffe could deliver, at best, a fraction of that, often less than 100 tons. Weather worsened. Airfields were lost. Aircraft were shot down. Starvation began. Frostbite spread. Ammunition ran low. By December, the army was no longer capable of a coordinated breakout without external relief. Why it was unwinnable by late 1942. By late November, several realities converged. The German Southern Front was overextended. Soviet reserves outnumbered German reserves. Air supply was insufficient. Relief forces lacked strength. Winter conditions compounded every weakness. Field Marshal Manstein launched a relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, but it stalled short of the encirclement. Paulus requested permission to break out. It was denied. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was fragmented, starving, and militarily exhausted. When Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal on January 30th, a rank no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered with, it was widely interpreted as pressure to commit suicide rather than surrender. He did not. On February 2nd, 1943, the remaining German forces surrendered. For the first time in the war, an entire German field army had been destroyed. The myth of invincibility was broken. The strategic initiative passed permanently to the Red Army. From this point forward, Germany would fight defensively in the east. Stalingrad was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a moment when German strategic overreach, logistical exhaustion, and political interference combined into irreversible collapse. And by late 1942, once encirclement occurred and airlift failed, the outcome was no longer realistically reversible. The human cost, casualties, and destruction, the scale of destruction at Battle of Stalingrad, was immense. But serious historical study requires caution with numbers. Casualty figures vary depending on definitions: killed, wounded, missing, captured, and whether Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian losses are included. Mainstream scholarly estimates generally conclude Axis casualties, approximately 600,000 to 750,000 total losses, including killed, wounded, and captured, with over 90,000 taken prisoner at surrender. Soviet casualties, often estimated at over 1 million total casualties, including roughly 400,000 to 500,000 killed. These numbers are staggering. Yet the scale alone does not explain the battle's significance. What made Stalingrad decisive was not simply how many died. It was what the losses represented. For Germany, the destruction of the Sixth Army meant the permanent loss of experienced officers, NCOs, and specialists. Equipment losses included thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, and aircraft. Replacement troops could not replicate the cohesion of a veteran field army. For the Soviet Union, the Red Army absorbed extraordinary losses. Entire formations were rebuilt from scratch. The industrial evacuation east of the Urals in 1941 now paid dividends. The city itself was almost completely destroyed. Civilian casualties were severe, though exact numbers remain debated. What had once been an industrial center on the Volga became a landscape of rubble and frozen corpses. But even amid devastation, the Red Army emerged strategically stronger. The operational transformation of the Red Army. To understand why Stalingrad changed the war, we must examine how the Red Army evolved between 1941 and late 1942. During Operation Barbarossa, Soviet forces were repeatedly encircled and destroyed. Command paralysis, poor coordination, and lack of experienced officers contributed to catastrophic losses. By late 1942, this had changed. Under leaders such as Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, Soviet command structures improved significantly. 3 key transformations occurred. 1. Mastery of operational art. Operation Uranus was not improvised. It involved Maskirovka deception, strategic concentration of armor, careful timing, coordinated multi-front assaults. Rather than attacking the strongest German positions inside the city, Soviet planners struck the weakest sectors on the flanks. This reflected a mature understanding of operational maneuver, something largely absent in 1941. 2. Industrial recovery. Soviet industry, relocated eastward beyond the Ural Mountains, dramatically increased production in 1942. T-34 tank output surged. Artillery production expanded. Ammunition shortages diminished. Germany, by contrast, had not yet fully mobilized its economy for total war. 3. Psychological resilience. Stalingrad demonstrated that German forces could be encircled and destroyed. This psychological shift cannot be overstated. From 1941 through mid-1942, the Wehrmacht had dictated the tempo of operations. After Stalingrad, the Red Army seized that initiative. German strategic consequences. The defeat at Stalingrad had cascading effects. First, it forced a general withdrawal from the Caucasus. Army Group A, deep in southern Russia, risked encirclement and had to retreat rapidly. Second, Axis allies, Romania, Hungary, Italy, suffered catastrophic losses. Their armies were shattered. Political confidence in German leadership declined. Third, Germany's manpower problem intensified. Even before 1943, Germany faced demographic constraints. The destruction of an entire field army deepened this crisis. Most importantly, Stalingrad shifted Germany permanently onto the strategic defensive in the east. Although Germany would attempt one more major offensive at Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the initiative had already passed to the Soviets. Kursk would confirm what Stalingrad had begun. The wider Allied context. Stalingrad also influenced global strategy. In 1942, the Western Allies had not yet opened a second front in Western Europe. However, the Anglo-American landings in North Africa, Operation Torch, began in November 1942, only days before Operation Uranus. While Torch and Stalingrad were not directly coordinated at the operational level, together they marked a turning point. For the first time, Germany faced simultaneous strategic setbacks in multiple theaters. Axis forces were retreating in both North Africa and Eastern Europe. Allied confidence grew significantly. Soviet leadership, particularly Joseph Stalin, used the victory to reinforce demands for a second front in France. Politically, Stalingrad strengthened Soviet leverage within the Allied coalition. Command decisions and responsibility. A central historical debate concerns responsibility for the disaster. Did the defeat result primarily from Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal, Göring's unrealistic airlift promises, Paulus' failure to disobey orders, or structural overreach inherent in the 1942 campaign. Most modern historians emphasize structural factors. Even if Paulus had attempted a breakout immediately after encirclement, success was uncertain. Fuel shortages were severe. Soviet forces were numerically superior. Weather conditions were deteriorating. However, Hitler's insistence on holding the city eliminated flexibility. His decision to divide army groups south months earlier contributed to overextension, and his refusal to permit elastic defense increased vulnerability. It is important, however, to avoid simplistic conclusions. The Wehrmacht's earlier successes had conditioned German leadership to believe boldness could overcome risk. By late 1942, that assumption no longer matched reality. Myths versus historical consensus. Stalingrad has generated powerful myths. Let's clarify several. Myth 1. Stalingrad was won purely by winter. Winter worsened conditions. But encirclement occurred before the worst of winter set in. The decisive factor was operational planning, not temperature alone. Myth 2. The Luftwaffe nearly succeeded in supplying the army. It did not. Logistical calculations show the required tonnage was unattainable with available aircraft and weather conditions. The failure was structural, not merely unfortunate. Myth 3. Stalingrad alone won the war. Stalingrad did not immediately end German offensive capacity. However, it marked the point at which Germany could no longer realistically achieve strategic victory in the East. The war would continue for over 2 years. But after Stalingrad, the direction of momentum had permanently changed. Why Stalingrad is still studied today. Modern military academies continue to examine Stalingrad for several reasons. Logistics as strategy. Operational reach must match supply capability. Urban warfare complexity. Dense terrain neutralizes technological superiority. Flank security. Weak allied sectors can determine strategic outcomes. Command flexibility. Political interference can eliminate operational options. Psychological momentum. Perception of invincibility can collapse suddenly. Stalingrad represents a case study in cumulative failure. Not a single mistake, but a chain of interconnected decisions. Final conclusion, the true turning point. So, how did a single battle turn the war? It turned the war because it revealed limits. The limits of German logistics. The limits of air supply. The limits of offensive reach. The limits of centralized command. And at the same time, it revealed Soviet resilience, industrial recovery, and operational maturity. By late 1942, once encirclement occurred and airlift proved insufficient, the Sixth Army's fate was effectively sealed. Stalingrad was not simply lost in the ruins of city. It was lost in overextended supply lines, strategic overconfidence, divided objectives, and the refusal to adapt. From February 1943 onward, the Red Army would advance westward relentlessly. Stalingrad marked a moment when the war in the East ceased to be a contest of German expansion and became a struggle for German survival. And in that sense, it truly was a battle that turned the war. If you found this analysis valuable, consider subscribing to Recorded Conflicts for more structured, evidence-based war history.